It's a me, it's Super Mario Ferraro. Welcome to the Winnipeg Jets to Mario and Henry Thrun.
Your Locked On Jets, your daily podcast on the Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Hey friends, and welcome to today's episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day, another number one sports podcast network. Thank you for joining us on tonight's episode. We're just a day or so into free agency. Teams have made lots of trades, lots of signings, and Winnipeg is no exception. They haven't really been too engaged in the trade market, barring the David Gustafsson thing, but obviously, we're all waiting for the big one to hit at some point. Who knows when the exact timing of that is? Seems like Buffalo and Winnipeg have very much dug their heels in, which makes the next couple of days super interesting. And amidst all this, of course, Chevy is speaking tomorrow. Should be an interesting presser, given that there's a lot that's changed post-draft. We've seen a lot of roster movement. And Winnipeg itself, I wonder if they're preparing for a younger team next year. Obviously, they have a lot of guys on the roster already, but perhaps we'll finally start to see more opportunities for the kids. And to close us out later, we'll talk about any other interesting free agents the Jets should keep an eye on. But of course, let's talk about the guys they added late yesterday and today. Winnipeg has brought in two defenders. The first is Mario Ferraro for 3 years at $4 million per. I like this deal, especially for a third-pairing defenseman who is quite a bit better than most of what the Jets have typically signed. I think Ferraro actually is really cheap for what he does. I was a little concerned that they might use him in a more top four role. I think he's been used to playing like 20-plus minutes for San Jose. I think in some ways that's a little bit too much to ask of him. But in a more second or third pairing role, I actually think the Jets could really see some solid returns. Certainly for a third pairing that has frankly struggled. Ferraro's just a really nice signing. And he quite publicly said he came to the Jets to win. The contract itself, I actually thought was cheaper than I expected. Only $4 million a season under the new cap. That's pretty cheap, I got to say. I think it's a really nice signing. It's going to be a contract that I think ages well. He's 27, so, he'll be 30 by the time the next deal rolls around. That's a great transition period contract if you're looking to fill some roster spots. But Ferraro might honestly do well enough to where if Winnipeg starts to move towards a retool or a rebuild, you could potentially flip him for some assets and give him a chance to win elsewhere. But I just think in the same vein that I look at the Stuart Skinner signing, these two contracts are very much win-win for both parties. The Jets get a really solid defenseman for a very cheap price. Ferraro gets a chance to perhaps prove himself worthy of moving to a contender if he doesn't want to stay long-term. That said, he is from Canada, so maybe he's, into what the Jets are offering. But yeah, either way, everyone, I think, comes out of this healthier on both ends of the deal. Thrun is just going to be more of a Moose signing, I would think. He just won the Calder Cup with the Toronto organization. He was down with the Marlies, ended up winning a Calder Trophy there. So, at his age, at 25, I think that's actually a pretty cool thing to add to your resume. And that sort of winning experience coming into a room that's going to be probably on the younger side. We're seeing the Moose cut bait with a number of the veterans. Could be interesting, right? You're bringing in technically championship caliber pedigree. That for a Moose team that has really struggled to find consistency, in part because the coaching staff hasn't allowed the team to really gel, but also because they've had some interesting challenges with their roster the last several years. They could use somebody who knows what it's like to win. I thought DiGiuseppe and co would kind of do that, but again, I think the coaching staff last year kind of had some challenges. The decisions with their deployments I didn't always agree with, and we'll see if this summer has some big staffing changes on that side of things. But Thrun, he's also a former Shark. I think he was one of their original draft picks, if I recall correctly, and has sort of bounced around the minors. So he'll mostly be a dude that you ask to eat up Moose minutes. Congrats to him. I think it's a pretty nice gig, and hopefully the Moose this year are good again. Last year's Moose were really underwhelming, especially for the amount of money that the Jets put into the team. Winnipeg correctly did assume that a winning Moose squad would be healthy for the organization. Manitoba was okay, and I think that's not really what they should have been. They should have been great. I don't know that they should have been Grand Rapids good, but they should have been a lot better than the team that really struggled to get through Milwaukee and then met their end in Grand Rapids. I think, for the Jets, especially with a team that, has struggled to develop prospects and graduate them to the NHL level, having a successful AHL organization is something that I think is really, really important for this team, especially when you're talking about a Jets team that everyone says, oh, they can't attract talent, they can't retain talent, yada, yada, yada. I hear all that noise, but having a nice intro pro step for the kids, I think could do a lot for the overall longer-term health of the organization. So I hope the Moose keep getting investments from the Jets. That's a smart play. I think Winnipeg is very wise to do that. It's a move I will champion every day of the week. Make your lower division club successful, and I think that can start to trickle up, is how we'll say, trickle up, right? I don't think that terminology necessarily exists, but hopefully, from an organization that just needs some really winning results, Manitoba can start to deliver those in the coming AHL seasons. But yeah, I like a lot of the Jets signings so far. I think Winnipeg has done a really good job of balancing, filling gaps without making too many spots blocked off to youth. I think they're making some really smart decisions on the timelines, on the costs in terms of cap hits. There's a lot of value in what the Jets have brought in, and it makes me wonder how much more are they planning to do. Gregor was a cheap signing. Skinner's a really solid value for a 1B or 1A type goalie. Ferraro will be really cheap, as this cap goes up for a third pairing guy who's a lot better than most of the third pairing defensemen we're used to. Thrun should be a really good Moose guy. I have to say free agency has been pretty nice for the Jets so far. Again, we're not really big free agency players to begin with. So when the Jets do make quality signings, I think it's worth putting a spotlight on it. Last summer, we had a spotlight on free agent signings for all the wrong reasons. This year, I have a very different read. I think the Jets have approached it smartly. I think they've done exactly what they should do as they start to move into a transition period. And hopefully at the end of all this, we'll see if any of these guys can really rehab their careers. Skinner, for me, is probably one of the more interesting ones. Ferraro, I think, has a pretty good reputation outside. But Skinner, his situation's a little different, right? We all have probably had at least a couple of jokes at his expense. After he got out of Edmonton, it was clear it wasn't always on him, right? His numbers improved enough in Pittsburgh to where you're like, okay, maybe it really was just playing in Edmonton that was the problem. And if he comes to a Jets team that has had one of the best goalies in NHL history and raised him up, you have to feel good about Skinner's chances of hopefully rehabbing his career. Honestly, it would just be a really cool story. And for the Jets, if Skinner becomes good, where whatever you get in the eventual Hellebuyck trade, on top of adding Skinner in free agency, if he really does pan out, you might have turned things around a lot faster than you expected, and on a rock bottom price tag. So don't let's not oversell this, right? But there's just a scenario where things can work out really nicely for the Jets if they can get Skinner back on track. But of course, there are still other gaps the team has to fill. Bjerk is a good step moving towards that, but we'll see how many other steps they're able to take over the next, couple of weeks and months. But of course, tomorrow the Jets are going to hear from, we're going to hear from the Jets, from Chevy himself. Want to chat about what I expect to hear, and I'm sure the questions he's going to start to get about the whole Hellebuyck thing. That remains one of the larger questions for this organization, and one that they have yet to really answer cleanly. But we'll talk about that coming right up. The biggest stage in soccer is here, and every match feels like it has the potential for a memorable moment. One goal can completely change the energy of a game, shift momentum, and alter the outcome in an instant. That's what makes tournament soccer so exciting, from the opening whistle to the final kick. Now, FanDuel is giving fans another reason to stay locked into every match with every goal pays. Bet on a match and get bonus bets for every goal scored in that match. More goals means more bonus bets. All you have to do is turn on your token. Obviously, for me as a Korean fan, not been the happiest of tournaments. But if you're looking ahead to some of the big games that are coming up, we've got Argentina, Cabo Verde, Colombia, and Ghana. And of course, for all of you Canadian fans, Canada versus Morocco. If you want to make the most of all of your World Cup watching experience, this is the time to get into FanDuel. Remember, every goal gets you a bigger payout, and you get to benefit. So from opening whistle to the final kick, let there be goals on FanDuel. Visit FanDuel.com to get started now. Hey friends, and welcome back to this episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day, and now the #1 sports podcast network. Thank you for joining us again. Tomorrow, we are going to hear from Kevin Cheveldayoff. Been a little bit since he last spoke. Obviously, we've had some media availabilities with the Jets the past few weeks, but overall, I think the team has been very busy trying to see things out, especially post-draft. And so what's interesting about this particular situation is, it's been pretty widely reported the Jets were on the doorstep of a deal with the Buffalo Sabres for Hellebuyck. That is still kind of hanging over the team right now. Hellebuyck wants out. That has been very clearly articulated. More and more of the media have been a little more aggressive, I would say, in putting it out there that he's done, like completely done, and has made that apparent to the team. So everyone is expecting a trade, right? We don't really know the exact timeline now. There's a little bit less of a rush. July 1st passed, and obviously Ukko-Pekka Luukkonen and Josh Norris, who had trade protection and were potentially rumored returns in the deal, those guys now have a no-trade list of some sort. Winnipeg's probably on it, so at least one of them you can pretty confidently write off as a return. Luukkonen, I actually don't know if he's quite so much a player you should write off in a deal like this. Luukkonen, if Hellebuyck goes there, UPL's minutes vanish, right? He's going to be relegated to a backup at best. Now, maybe he's okay with that, but if I was Luukkonen and I'm looking at how Hellebuyck came to be, and I'm thinking about the future of my career, I'm looking at the Jets, and I'm thinking that might not actually be the worst place. Just like Stuart Skinner is going there to potentially turn his own career around, if you're Luukkonen, you might look at the Jets as a real opportunity. You're going to get a chance to fight for a starting role. If things work out the way that they might with Skinner, you could not only pick your next destination, but you might also just become the Jet starter for the future. Maybe he can finally turn, the next couple of years around and become the guy that I think a lot of Sabres fans expected him to be. And you're going to the organization that supported Hellebuyck to become one of the most dominant goalies. I don't think the no trade thing is as difficult to work around as it might first appear. Now, again, moving to Winnipeg is a little bit of a challenge for some guys, and maybe that will be enough to push Luukkonen away. But if I'm thinking about in his shoes, what would I be willing to do, and where could I go to really find the best training and support for my specific position? Luukkonen would be really hard-pressed to find other organizations outside of Winnipeg that have demonstrable success with goalies. I think Winnipeg really has a secret sauce for anyone in goal. Just look at what happened to Comrie in his limited starts this past year when he came back. He was posting like 900-plus save percentages in a year in which the league average was below that. So, that might not sound impressive, but I'm telling you, for an NHL that has been starved for many elite starters, we only have a handful. There is a real chance that being a Jets goalie is actually kind of an appealing position for that very specific subset of players. But if Luukkonen just firmly says no to Winnipeg, totally understand. It's not necessarily a place that I'm sure is high on his destination list. I would get it. I think he's turning down a really good opportunity to rehab his own career, but I would understand. I think moving him is actually pretty easy for the Sabres. There are teams out there that definitely need another starter, somebody that can hopefully rebound and maybe turn things around. Luukkonen's not been awful, right? He's had some solid seasons. So in terms of his desirability, I bet you somebody out there would be willing to take him on, and it would give Buffalo the cap space to kind of facilitate whatever this Jets deal is going to be. In terms of what we keep hearing, Jack Quinn has been the most common name. That's definitely coming from the Sabres. They're really trying to force the Jets to take Quinn on. I have no interest. I think Quinn is okay. I think he's like nicer Drew Stafford. And for me, that's just not really appealing. UPL, Jack Quinn, and like a first it's mid, right? That's what it is. And people will say, well, the Jets have to make a move if you're a Sabres fan, and that's what they're going to do, and they'll just happily accept it. Well, no, the Jets can wait this out, and there are still other teams out there that would be potentially willing to make a big splash. Don't discount Utah making a move here, especially since they've got their own Barrett Hayton situation going through, the offer sheet stuff. I think that there's some real interesting machinations that could happen here, depending on how, all of these teams sort of play these next few weeks. But all that to say, there will be a Hellebuyck trade at some point. I don't really doubt that. I thought the draft would be the best way to do it. And I think, a number of teams kind of came close, but it seems like, for one reason or another, there was a very specific stumbling block, and the Jets have set a high price. For once, I think that's fine. I think the Jets are well within their rights to do so. We can all talk about Chevy overplaying his hand, and I get it. I think if he talks about this tomorrow, I'm personally not expecting him to really give too much insight. I would expect him to say, if he's asked about the Hellebuyck trade, we're having conversations, we're talking through it, we're not looking to rush through anything. I think there is some internal urgency to try and figure this out before you start getting closer and closer to preseason and camp. But because you're not really talking about draft picks that you have to make in a couple of days, and you have a little bit more freedom and latitude during this free agency period to sort this out, I think the Jets are going to try and wait this out for as good of a return as they can. I think that 104 for 108 package was not quite that great when you look at how the returns balanced. Would I have done it? I guess, but I also respect the Jets not agreeing to it at the time. And so far, their gamble has paid off. So maybe they can pull out another rabbit out of their hat. If they somehow get Helenius, even in just a 1-for-1 deal, basically, you call that a huge win. I doubt Helenius is going to be in this package, but just, that's like the dream scenario. You come away with an Östlund or something very solid, right? You'll need a little bit more on top of Östlund, but that's a good return. Kulik, I would be a little less entranced by. He's fine. I think he's a really solid prospect. But again, I think I have a couple of clear names. I have a couple of hierarchies in this whole return. So just think about that heading into whenever this trade gets announced. But otherwise, I think Chevy might talk a little bit about fortifying some additional depth positions. Maybe they add a couple of Moose guys. They've had some camp invitees already. Some of the young players are already in Winnipeg doing their fun stuff. We got to see some footage of Viggo Bjork already shielding a puck and doing some one-on-one engagement drills with puck carriers. You should see the video of him marking Colby Barlow, man. Wow. Let me tell you, he is a gremlin. And I mean that in the most optimistic and positive way possible. This kid's just him, dude. He's going to be an absolute pain in both cheeks and then elsewhere. He will not let you go. And I think that's going to be so much fun to watch as a Jets fan. Even if the points values don't necessarily reflect on the score sheet, he's going to be an absolute monster in driving play. I'm so hyped for Viggo Bjork. In terms of free agency, though, I think that's going to be the real extent of what I think most of the Jets' moves are going to be. I think we've seen their big signings. Obviously, they have to figure out the Perfetti thing. That is a little bit concerning in some ways, but I suspect we'll see a short-term deal, and they'll revisit it again in a couple of seasons. They really seem not super keen to overly commit to Perfetti. Perfetti himself wanted the long-term deal last time. Didn't happen. Now we kind of see, in a way, the Jets were right about his overall production, but I think they've also kind of recognized if you give him the skill to work with and the talent to work with, he'll shine for you. And that has been something the Jets were talking about trying to sort out either at the draft or via trade. So they know he's a good player. I don't think they really want him to go anywhere. I think they'll sort out a short-term deal, and then we'll figure out maybe a long-term deal later into his career. But yeah, that does hang around there. And at some point, like if they really hit an impasse, I do wonder if Perfetti is traded, right? If it's clear that an extension just isn't possible and you need to move some roster stuff around, maybe Perfetti gets moved in another separate trade. But I hope it doesn't reach that point because I really like Cole. He's one of my favorite Jets, and we'll always remember 1.6 forever, no matter whether he's a Winnipeg player or not. But outside of Perfetti, right, we mentioned that there might be some other free agents of interest. I want to talk about a couple of guys that I'm still thinking about. There's like two wingers in particular that sort of stand out. I think both could potentially be assets for the Jets. I don't know if either of them is willing to sign in Winnipeg, but at least one of those two might have a real shot at doing so, especially because his playoff performance did not exactly go well, and he probably needs to rehab his own image. We'll talk about that coming right up. As companies grow, customer support gets a lot more complicated. More customers means more questions, more channels to manage, and higher expectations for fast, personalized service. That's usually when businesses start turning to AI, but most solutions either feel too generic or take forever to implement. That's where Decagon comes in. Decagon helps companies create personalized, concierge-style customer experiences with AI agents across chat, email, voice, and SMS. Their agents are available 24/7, they feel natural to talk to, and can resolve customer requests on their own, helping businesses scale support without losing that personal touch. Obviously, the Jets have been doing a lot of off-the-ice stuff, trying to offer more ticket packages and make the fan experience better when they're actually in the arena. And I think that's actually had a pretty tangible impact on, fan sentiment. Obviously, the team itself has still not been that great, but you know what? When the Jets show that they really do care about the community and respond to their feedback, I see it reflected in a lot of the way fans talk about the team. They like the ticket packages. They like all that stuff. And just like, the Jets have overhauled a lot of their own business stuff and have made a lot of their systems more integrated, you can too with your own business through Decagon. Are you ready to transform your customer support? Go to decagon.ai/LockedOnNHL to get a personalized demo and see what Decagon can do for your team. That's decagon.ai/LockedOnNHL. Hey friends, and welcome back to these closing thoughts on tonight's episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day, and now the number one sports podcast network. Thank you so much for rejoining us on tonight's show. Obviously, we are heading into the final stages of free agency, or at least like the big signings, right? There are some guys out there that I think teams are still very much interested in, but for the most part, I think a lot of teams have already made their bigger moves. For Winnipeg, though, obviously, we know how free agency can be. Not always the happiest experience as a Jets fan. But I've said this before, I don't think the Jets should ever try to build through free agency. Not only is it hard to attract those kinds of players, but most of them are older. And most of them, if you sign them, you are already in a contending stage trying to put your team over the top. If you're a team like the Jets, that's not really where you are. Free agency here should be more about looking for some potential career rehabbers, right? Guys who could turn around, maybe some guys who could put butts in seats, but who don't necessarily move the team for you or move the needle for your team competitively. One of the big names I'm seeing from a lot of Jets fans again, and we love talking about him. I know some of you hate him. That's not really shocking. I'll say right up, he's bad these days, but it's always Patrick Laine, right? Laine is like a prodigal son of sorts. I think on a very short-term deal at a reasonably cheap price, Laine would be cool to have back. He's like a pretty much guaranteed 20-plus goal scorer type. If you put him on your power play, the guy can just pretty much outscore a lot of his worst tendencies. The overall value with him is that, he is kind of like what people used to say about Ovechkin. He stands there, he shoots, he scores, and that's the extent of what you're getting. If you can put him with the right players, especially those who do a lot more of the defensive work, you can probably make Laine's value actually work. He's also a guy that I could very much see moving in a trade deadline deal if you were to bring him in for a short thing, pump his value up, and then move him at the TDL. Let him try and chase a ring with some team that's a little bit better equipped to handle his particular idiosyncrasies. But I think Jets fans just want him back, right? He's just a fun guy. He's the one that kind of got away from Winnipeg, and we haven't really been linked to him, so I don't think it's very likely. not recently at least, but it's not inconceivable. It could be a thing that the Jets at some point invest in if they really start getting desperate. The two guys that I kind of think are a little bit more interesting, though, are Anthony Mantha and Eeli Tolvanen. Tolvanen, I'll just say right off, I don't know that he would be that interested in coming to the Jets. I think he'll probably look for a more competitive team, but, he's usually been in a middle six role, which has suppressed a lot of his scoring. I think he's one of those really sneaky bets where if you sign him and you put him in your top six, you're going to be laughing to the bank. I think he's primed for a 30-goal season. I think Tolvanen is a fantastic option. If you give him like a 4-year deal, I could easily see him being well worth the price, and he would be a very tradable asset a couple of seasons in. Mantha, kind of a similar position. Mantha's a little older, though, and he just came off of a really good year with Pittsburgh that completely imploded once he got to the playoffs. He probably needs to rehab his image a bit, and I think the Jets could be an intriguing spot. If I recall correctly, at one point, the Jets were actually looking to trade for Mantha in one of their previous playoff runs. Never really came to fruition, but Mantha is a big power forward. He's got a great shot. He's not overly physical, but he is a fun player and somebody who I think, again, is very much like a TDL fodder kind of guy. You pump his value up, you let him chase a ring somewhere, and you probably get some pretty good assets if things really work out. For the Jets, I think, is it worth the cap hit and financial investment? Potentially, right? I think both these kinds of guys offer a bit of a different dynamic for your team. Tolvanen, you could conceivably keep around longer. He might actually be somebody that you want to sign now and just have for when you start reaching a more competitive state. He would very clearly solve a big gap on the wing depth. Will he be at the level of an Ehlers? No, right? That's probably a little bit much to expect. But I think he's a really good player and somebody that if he is willing to come to the Jets and they were to give him like a 6-year deal, I would not complain. I think it kind of pushes a little bit further away from the overall direction that I would say the Jets should probably go in. But again, Winnipeg wants to be closer to competition. They want to try and make the playoffs. Tolvanen, I think, is the kind of signing that gets you there, but is also just really good value. And if they can get him for like $6 million or something, I think that's a really good deal. So we'll see, right? Those kinds of guys I'm thinking about. In terms of the centers, there's no one else really that it's standing out to me. I think the Jets are pretty fine on defense too. So really it's just looking for a couple of wingers who can kind of fill out those flanks and give the Jets a little bit more firepower up front. And we'll see if maybe some of the Jets prospects can push any of these guys in camp. But curious to know if there are free agents out there that have caught your eye. Is there anyone you're interested in? Let me know in the YouTube comments below or at my social medias at HLLivingLoco and at LO_Winnipeg Jets on Twitter. For tonight's episode, though, that's going to be all the time that we have. Tomorrow we'll have some thoughts on whatever Chevy feedback we get, maybe even a Jets trade announcement. We'll see. I doubt that the Hellebuyck thing is coming tomorrow, but we'll see, right? Now that there's no rush, I think both teams are going to be playing a lot of poker with each other. So we'll hold off until then, but see you then. Have a great night, and as always, go Jets go.